Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and today I will be reading for you the final chapter of Micronation as chapter 20, in-game, followed by the epilogue. Chapter 20, in-game. I was fairly convinced that the afterlife was not an office in Hler. While I felt miserable, I was, quite clearly, not dead. Pardon the melodrama, I slowly stood up and looked around. Ferret hadn't come back to finish the job. There was an alarm ringing through my ears. I could hear the occasional explosion in the distance. I grabbed a nearby chair while the room continued to spin around and around. I moved to the door. I heard voices coming from one of the rooms nearby, one of which I recognized as Darla's. I was not in handcuffs, so they might not know what I had done with the meme generator. Maybe Ferret had just left me for dead. I decided that I could not take the chance and staggered around towards the elevator. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion above us and cheering. Apparently, Hler was not the only group taking fire in all this. I breathed a sigh of relief as the elevator doors closed in front of me. The pain in the back of my head was getting worse. I pushed the button for the top floor. I wanted to know what was going on, but I also wanted to get the hell out of Dodge. I almost blacked out as the elevator rose, but I struggled to consciousness. 3 floors came and went, though it felt like an eternity. 3,000 years came by and went. The doors opened, running soldiers, flames, explosions, and certain death, and the men's haberdashery awaited me. I looked up into the sky and saw a dozen unmanned drones shaped like helicopters fighting something large and very black and very bulky. I stumbled into the cafeteria. It had been converted into a giant LAN party, but no one was having any fun. All of them, about 200, had very intense expressions. As I gazed on the screens, I realized that I was looking at vivid, real-time images of the battle over the compound in the Pacific. Several of the drones seemed to be jets of some kind, only they seemed to be battling at least 3 different aircraft carriers, and that was just what I could see. I noticed a big, wide television screen in one side of the room. Hler had drones fighting all over the world. Subs and jets and helicopters and something on land, although what it was hard to determine. There were a handful of people looking at the grid and occasionally typing into a keyboard and just watching the crowd around. One of them noticed me and pointed me out to the others. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing. I considered running, but I felt faint and sat down. I wasn't going anywhere. 3 of them came closer. I recognized one of them as the young man who worked for Onyx. To my relief, none of them looked angry, just very concerned. Obviously, Ferret hadn't told them about my treachery yet. The tallest one asked, "Are you all right?" After a pause, he added, "Your Grace," at the end, quite awkwardly. He knew me, even if I didn't recognize him. There was a weary look in his eyes I'd never seen in someone his age. In fact, they all had it. Whoever thought that post-traumatic stress syndrome couldn't happen to someone who controlled a drone halfway around the world clearly didn't understand people. There was a difference between a drone and a video game, and anyone with experience at either knew that. I answered, "I bumped my head and blacked out. What's going on?" Halson, the one I knew, smiled slightly. "We're winning, for now." The taller one nodded. "Yeah, but we're pissing off a lot of people, too." An alarm went off at the console on the wall. "Speaking of which," the third said, and dashed back towards the keyboard. All the screens in the room suddenly went black, and everything except the alarm went silent. The only light came from a few cracks outside the door and LEDs on the computers. It had that eerie flashlight on your face effect, making all the others appear sinister and wicked. Halson whispered, breaking the silence, "They got the relay." "I thought the whole point of quantum data teleportation was that it bypassed all that," I asked. Halson's taller companion shook his head. "No, Halson means the relay that holds our end up on the quantum link. We're networked to it." "Well, where is it?" I asked. "It's down on the 2nd level. The third, still whispering, "I don't remember any troops being down there." "Well, something sure is," I said, as I grabbed a gun off the counter and started to limp away. Halson started to protest, but I cut him off. "Show me where the relay is." Halson didn't look happy, but he listened to me. Rank, even crazy rank, hath its privileges. Back down into the bowels of Hler we went. I expected to hear the sound of gunfire, but there was nothing there. We bypassed the damage one of the panicked people had caused to the hallway, but that was merely debris, really. I wondered for a moment why they didn't just destroy Hler, but then I realized the civilian casualties would look bad. That, and I guessed that they wanted to take it intact for their own uses. We came across a long hallway full of green glowing boxes with a ridged slant on one side. Halsin whispered, "These are the links. There's nothing wrong here, so it must be in the network terminal." He pointed on the opposite wall. I saw someone hiding in the shadows. Lysol was my first reaction, as Prow's knobby-headed assistant turned around and pointed a pistol at me. He started shooting. I shouted, "What are you doing?" "They offered me a pardon," was all he gave as an explanation as he shot 3 more times. I ducked behind the door. Wasn't this guy trained CIA? Why was he such a bad shot? "Yeah, they offered me a pardon too, and look how that turned out." "You did that to yourself." He shot 4 times, and I could hear him putting up another clip. My body went into automatic. I tore around the corner and leapt on top of Lysol. We fought for the gun. He shot me in the stomach and hit me in the head. I suddenly felt nauseous and threw up all over him. He got another shot off, but then the lights came back on. Halsin shot Lysol on the head. I couldn't care less as I just lay on the floor rolling in pain. I heard many words around me. I saw 4 or 5 people running around doing technical type things. There was a small obscure part of my mind that was utterly grossed out by having a dead Lysol brain on my face, but I could barely move. They had to pry him out of my arms to carry me outside. The lights flickered off and on, and I saw spots. I vaguely heard some kind of cheering and remembered a paramedic looking over me and saying something about internal bleeding and dying and needing a hospital. All I knew was pain. Pain going up the stairs, pain from shouting, pain in my throat from throwing up again, pain as I felt someone punch me in the stomach, and then my head felt heavy, like it was filled with water, and then there was no more pain. Epilogue. Amberlove. 5 years passed. Chester wasn't dead, but he might as well have been. I had been able to collect almost all of his story from his pained mutterings. The scanners said he had no higher brain function, but the fact that he just kept talking kept them from cutting the cord. Just like Chester, too stubborn to shut up and die. Even when his own living will mandated that they cut the cord. Not that the population of Hler wanted him dead. It took a full day for Chester's meme to take effect, but when it did, it changed the world. And how? Saving Hler was the least it did. People were different now. Well, most people. The long-term effects were still working themselves out, but I had great hope for the future. I closed the book and looked at the ceiling. I'd written the last words with a deep sense of melancholy. I was in love with Vegetable. The doctor said that the odds were that he was never coming out of the coma, but it was a very weird coma. They'd never seen someone talk in a coma before. I felt that I could be kind with him, even if I was only listening to the odd little narrations. Then again, that wasn't strikingly different than our original relationship. Chester didn't exactly listen to me a lot. I considered hooking up with my ex-husband, but Chester's meme hadn't been enough to free him from the effects of living with me for 1.5 years. There was a part of me that truly wanted to believe that he was responsible for the change himself. I don't know. Chester had managed to free Kim, but a lot of Hler's experts are fairly convinced it was because Chester crafted the words of the meme himself. I don't know. I wish I did. I picked up the book I had been writing in and moved slowly through the halls of Hler, passing through them and under one of the greater monuments that they'd built. They had a monument fever in Hler now, some kind of side effect of Chester's meme. There were some people who were convinced that the rising generation wouldn't be affected by it. Most people didn't believe that. After all, it wasn't like the world was now a utopia, though some might call it such. There were still wars and violence. Crime and poverty still plagued many areas. The world could only change so much in 5 years, and in some ways, if you did have a time machine and could leap from one year to the other, you wouldn't notice many differences on the surface. And yet, in other ways, the world was a totally different place. Some countries, mostly democracies like the US and Europe, had a citizens' awakening. People started attending town hall meetings and government hearings. They started reading news. Everyone had to, and they hated it. The news had to start having substance again, so entire elements of industry were turned on their heads. People still liked fictional explosions and cheap dramas or comedy, but when it came to actually living their lives, they were literally forced against their will to think for themselves, and it hurt. One man described it as having your smarter older brother inside your head making you do your homework when you really wanted to play video games and eat ice cream. But things did get better. Businesses and governments were suddenly paying a lot more attention to what people wanted. And it wasn't just the politics of the mob, but well thought out, detailed, and crafted attention. The Founding Fathers would have been happy if they hadn't been horrified by the fact that they were doing it because Chester had made them. Who am I kidding? I made them. I had known that Chester was going to do something like this. That's why I had left the main blank. But Chester had a way of making the right decisions in things like this. I'd hardly call him a moral compass, but sometimes he knew just what to do. And this was one of those times. But I have just as much blame as he does. And what was the alternative? Memes were terrible, and Chester was right. I only have to look at my ex-husband or the tapes of what Kim used to be like to know what a world where people can have their brains shut off at will is like. Chester didn't tell them to be good or bad. He didn't say that they had to like this philosophy or that philosophy. He just said that they had to start thinking for themselves, and that's what they did. The countries that didn't have a safety valve for their newly awakened citizens were a lot worse. The people in those nations that tried peaceful, non-violent protest at first, but that didn't work. The problem was that they couldn't just go back to their lives and pretend like nothing had happened. This was the bad side of Chester's meme. Some countries were plunged into civil war. Some just saw massacre after massacre as people kept protesting. Eventually, in most countries, the people were able to convince the government to give them liberty by simply refusing to work. They basically refused to do anything at all. A lot of governments caved in at this point, but it was the hardcore elements that tried forcing people to work at gunpoint. That worked in North Korea for a while, but eventually that government became more and more insane until they tried to nuke someone. That solved the North Korea problem. I walked past the memorial and towards the park. Hler had grown a lot in the last 5 years. People were pouring all kinds of money into it, though most of the growth in Hler Prime was now underwater. They were making a regular underwater metropolis down there, but everything they dug underwater, they tried to expand things up on the hill for things that didn't work underwater, like parks and a stadium. Of course, the growth in Hler Prime didn't compare to Tuvalu. Chester had made the right decision as usual. The space elevator was due to be completed in 5 years, and when it was, the whole of the heavens would belong to us. I was actually going to be able to see space. It was so exciting. It was so exciting. I wish Chester were here to see it. Oh, there were some things he wouldn't like at all. I smiled and took a picture out of my purse. Darla and Prow had such a lovely wedding. They were the new Camelot. Darla was the queen, Prow was the king, and little Quiescence the first was their prince. Of course, technically they were merely Duke and Duchess of Tuvalu, acting as regent for Quiescence the first, but everyone treated them like royalty. I sat down at the bench and looked up. The sky was a perfect blue today. Good weather for Hler. Darla and Prow made me think about Chester, about how outraged he'd been at Prow raising his son, or at how outraged he'd be at Prow raising his son, about how Prow wouldn't even understand why Chester would be angry, and how I was in love with essentially a dead man. True, Chester wasn't really dead, but in some ways that was worse. I started a few relationships. I wasn't totally stupid after all. In the end, none of them worked. I wanted Chester, and no matter how hard I tried to, I still did.
This has been a Me production. We hope you enjoyed it.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the final commentary at the end of the chapter of Micronation. I like this format. I'll probably do it at least for the next novel. I currently have plans for... So let's walk through the novels, right? So anybody listening to this would have to somehow be interested in my writing career. So I will happily recount that. So the first novel was a gift to my mother. I called it Eye of the Mindstorm. It took me, like 5 or 6 years to write, forever to get those first 100,000 words out the door. This one took me like 3, with a 2-year gap on one of the chapters. I believe it was chapter 15. Neither novel, in my opinion, is salvageable in terms of publishing it. I have a high standard at self-publishing, and if I cut out huge words and so on and so forth in the second novel, maybe parts of it could be salvaged. But the fifth chapter on this, The Case of the Cockroach Robot, is usually where people just stop reading, because it's just such a ridiculous idea that. And they're probably wise to quit reading, because it just gets more and more ridiculous from there. The third novel, Grenade Man vs. the Zombies, is, of the published or finished ones, definitely my best so far. It is available on Amazon.com and a lot of other places. The audiobook for this is also available on my YouTube channel. It is by far and away the most popular. It is also read by an absolutely excellent voice actor named Matthew Smith, who, even though the recording he did is not eligible for audio or audible at some point, I would, on my bucket list, I'd love to go back and hire him to read the last chapter and reread the whole thing in an audio format that I can upload to Audible. It's certainly on my to-do list, but I've got a lot of things on my to-do list. The fourth novel, Pre-Cyber, I wrote with Ken Leitner. Long story short, Ken and I were good friends. Now we're okay friends. We haven't talked in a long time. There's a lot of reasons for that, but even then, we still had kind of different philosophies on how much needed to be edited and how to edit it. At the end of the day, Pre-Cyber was never going to go anywhere. Both of us wrote it, about half of that. It was around 100,000 words as well. Pre-Cyber, and the fact that it was just sitting around and was never going to have anything happen, was actually the motivation for starting this podcast 9 years ago. And I read it, and you can hear the audio book of it on my YouTube channel. Nowhere near the number of hits of Grenade Man vs. Zombies, for obvious reasons, because it's never had an edit pass. And in my opinion, you should have about 20 to 30% of it just cut out. But I read it as is because I got permission from Ken to read it for my podcast, but he didn't have a voice in how I would edit that, and so since we wrote it together, it just seemed completely unfair and inappropriate for me to excise large chunks of it. So it's basically a very, very good first draft and should be taken as such. My fifth novel is definitely the most interesting of the ones that is published. It's a steampunk novel, where I did, in fact, excise the entire second half of the book once I realized how bad it was compared to the first half of the book, so it ends on a cliffhanger. I do currently have plans to write a sequel to it, Eternally East, where there's going to be a time skip, because the more I looked at it, the more the second half of the book was just not salvageable as it was. So I'm going to go forward to the next interesting bit of story and do my best to orient the casual reader between book A and book B. I will probably start writing between that and Armor of Stone, which is going to be the second in the Inglemia books that I'm writing, at the same time. Normally, I've never done that before, but given that I am not as fast a writer as I want to be, ambition exceeds reality there for sure. I am going to be trying to write one every other day while doing short stories and just go at the fastest pace I can. Maybe even trying to write both novels a little bit every day. But I am not a fast writer. If someday I become able to support myself on doing this, which is highly unlikely, who knows? I mean, in terms of my maximum writing speed, I've written 2,000 words in an hour before. So by that definition, I could bang out a novel over the weekend. Of course, it would be crap. On the other hand, both Grenade Man vs. the Zombies and Air of Sunfire, which is a 6th novel, were both written basically in a month. Grenade Man vs. the Zombies was written in a challenge back when zombies were really popular about 12 years ago, and my parents convinced me to write for it, and that turned out to be a good thing. I didn't overthink the details too much, which is very appropriate for a novel titled Grenade Man vs. the Zombies. Air of Sunfire I wrote for National Novel Writing Month, which was a 6th novel. It's the next one I'm going to be reading. It's much better than the other unpublished novels, which is, of course, the 1st, 2nd, and 4th novel. It will eventually be published, but it's going to need to be rewritten. As it is, even to do this one, I've determined that it needs another 3 chapters. And that will be in the version I read to you. Ultimately, that's going to be in a project that I'm going to do after the Inglemia books, or at least after the first 3 to 5 Inglemia books, called Lasers Against the Dark Lord. Love that title. It's probably going to be my magnum opus. I may just flat out stop writing after that. It's going to be 3 anthologies of the old, back when you used to see those books of fairy tales, the red fairy tale book, the blue fairy tale book, etc. And it's going to be, the first one will be the Book of Heliotropic Fairy Tales, which will contain several short stories and at least 3 novellas. One is going to be Air of Sunfire, which I'll be reading to you. The other one, which will be kind of the core of the story that I'm telling there. The other one is going to be Fruit Loop and Frankenstein, which I'm co-writing with my wife. And then the third one is probably going to be about the 3 mice that see, which you will meet in Air of Sunfire, which should be starting after this one fairly quickly. And then, of course, the 7th book that I'm writing right now is called Army of Fire. It is the first in a book set in my D&D setting in Inglemia. It is military fantasy. There's probably going to be at least 5 of them. And I'm completely blowing the doors off of this one in terms of just, wizardry versus sci-fi. It's going to be interesting, to say the least. And I've determined already that I'm going to be writing quite a bit of them. I'll provide updates as I go along. Right now I'm at about 101,000 words, and it has proven to be very difficult to get through the current chapter. Hopefully I'll get over my writer's block. Either way, my goal is to finish it by the end of the year. With this October, it'll have been 2 years for me writing it, which is one of the reasons why I'm thinking about co-writing both of those books at the same time. So let's talk a little bit more about the novel overall, right? So as a writer, the lessons I learned from this are, first of all, not every fucking character needs an arc. They just don't. Other lessons include, it does not matter if you set your plot in the real world, if all of the characters in it are assholes, most of the people you want to read it will not be interested. And even though Chester kind of redeems himself at the end here, most of the characters are assholes and only, frankly, become even bigger assholes as time goes on. Some of the ideas that I had for this book were way ahead of their time. I wrote this book in 2009 through 2011. The timeline might be a little bit wrong there. I think I might have started it in 2007. But either way, drones were only kind of on the edge there. And I definitely called it in terms of, how those are going to be bigger and bigger in war. I think the novel actually ages well just because, despite the fact that everybody uses drones now, a drone that you can control halfway across the world with advanced robotics would still be a generation ahead of everybody else. Other things that I find highly amusing that aged well is the general antagonistic behavior of the Russians/Klingons in China. Some things that have definitely not aged well is when I wrote this thing, I had a lot of friends who were developers, and a lot of developers, not all of them, are libertarian. you can listen to my political episodes of the podcast to understand my attitude towards most libertarianism. Technically speaking, I don't have an issue with libertarianism, but right libertarianism I do, because basically, in my opinion, all conservative ideology is, well, lies, and I have a really big issue with lies. Lies on the left, lies in the middle, lies on the right, lies by statists, lies by anarchists. If you lie, you don't have my allegiance or my interest. And boy, do people on the right lie far more than anybody else, and I'm sure people on the right would disagree, but because they lie, I don't care about the opinion about people who lie. Other things that have kind of aged well is, like I said, there have been, in the comments in the last podcast, there have in fact been attempts to create these micronations. I originally came up with the idea of the whole novel based on a fascinating place called Sealand. And I don't think I've talked about this in comments, so I'll bring it up very quickly. So Sealand is basically an attempt by somebody to take advantage of a loophole in international law by creating their own little country on an abandoned defense platform just outside the 12-mile international limit of England, in the channel between England and France. So the idea is that it's technically land because it's, an abandoned platform. And since it's not near other countries and it's not claimed by other countries, they can, by right of fiat, set up their own little country. And so Sealand, which is by far the oldest and most well-known of these micronations, basically declared itself a country. But as I go into the novel, just because you call yourself a country doesn't mean you are one, as actual legitimate pseudo-countries have found, right? In some cases, that's good. In the case of, Transnistria or the puppet states of the Soviet/Russian regime in eastern Ukraine, which basically were created due to colonization and are crap, or legitimate attempts by a small region to break away from a larger region that has no interest in the well-being of its participants, such as Catalonia from Spain or Scotland from the UK. And I support the right of self-determination. And this novel, a lot of things have changed in my political beliefs, but one of the things that has not changed is my firm belief that countries should be allowed to separate from the larger body. It's self-determination is a right in the UN Charter and in the Charter of Human Rights, and a right that you can't ever take advantage of is meaningless. And while a few countries have been created under official sanction and approval, like South Sudan, Eritrea, the vast majority of regions that want independence have to fight for it. And they have to exhaust the parent government to the point that everybody else lets them go. I think the best example I can think of a country/region that has a very, very good argument for independence because they get screwed over is Kurds. Because they get screwed over by Syria, they get screwed over by Turkey, they get screwed over by Iran, and they get screwed over by Iraq. And they have a very, very, very solid sense of nationhood. And frankly, they're really cool people, right? For the region, they're very feminist, they're very progressive, and yet these other tyrannical regimes, and I'm definitely throwing Turkey in the concept of tyrannical regime at this point, basically stomp on the Kurds every chance they get. And if we had an internationally recognized right to self-determination, then the Kurds could have their own country and get it recognized by a majority of people in the United Nations and go from there. There are reasons that and the main reason, in my opinion, why it's so difficult for a smaller nation to get independence is Spain. Spain is, in case you're unaware, exists in large part due to the efforts by, they're kind of an anthology country, right? Where they in the 15th century, the monarchy took over all of the other smaller kingdoms to resist the Moors. But there are lots of little small regions of Europe that consider themselves, Normandy or XYZ, mainly because of the feudal nature of things. But Spain, even more so, has had nationalist movements in multiple areas, most notoriously by the Basque separatist movement and Catalonia, for quite some time. In fact, Catalonia was very independent in the Spanish Civil War and was the last holdout against the dictatorship of Franco. And Franco comes along after he dies, and they arrange for a dictator-dictated constitution they were so grateful for democracy that they were going to accept whatever and ratify whatever. But part of that constitution says that the Union of Spain as it is sacred and can never be divided, right? And they did that as a way to sop the far right, which still thinks that Franco is really cool. And so Spanish courts and the Spanish legal system refuses to recognize any desire to have independence because it's literally hardwired into their constitution that they can't separate. And so because Spain is part of the EU, and EU is a proxy superpower in everything but military, then that shit goes to the UN. So because Spain doesn't want to lose Catalonia, doesn't want to lose the Basque region, and doesn't even want to entertain the idea, that reflects in EU policy, which in turn reflects in UN policy. So even though the UN Charter of Human Rights says that self-determination is a right, it's virtually impossible unless the parent country says it's okay. And that appeases Spain, right? It's okay for South Sudan, after a bloody, decades-long civil war, to separate from Sudan because of a bunch of arrogant imperialist assholes carved up Africa in a way that was meaningless to the people involved. And so because of Spain, independence of a small nation is very, very difficult to obtain. And you might make an argument about the Confederacy, but here's the thing about the Confederacy. The Confederacy was evil because of slavery, and the legality of their ability to secede is a separate question. It's kind of like eugenics, right? The idea of improving humanity and our gene pool is something that we're still exploring, right? But the idea of doing it through eugenics or selective breeding is now so anathema because of the dark and racist applications that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century that in the popular mind, they are one and the same, right? Nobody has an argument about, if somebody has a super rare disorder, using gene therapy to cure it, right? And some people are okay with us using gene therapy to improve ourselves. There are dangers there, and I'm not going to open that Pandora's box in commentary that has nothing to do with the novel. But my point is that very often, especially people in the left in the United States, associate being able to secede to the Confederacy, which is bullshit, because our country itself was entirely founded on the idea of rebellion against Great Britain and would not exist had we not been able to do the Declaration of Independence. Now, I think the Declaration of Independence does a pretty good job of setting when the moral case is to separate from a country, which is that the government has to have both evil action and evil intent. And it's pretty much there in the preamble in the first couple of paragraphs, right? So, but on the other hand, evil is relative. For example, I do not regard the government of Spain as evil, but I can actually say that I do regard the government of the UK as evil at this point. They're not as evil as other places. They do some good, but the Tories are kind of nasty. And with regards to Scotland, it is definitely both evil action and evil intent. With the case of Catalonia, it's more gray in terms of intent, right? But I would argue that Spain's enforcement of its dictated constitution does cross the line into evil because of some of the things that they've done with, like, political prisoners and locking people up and using the judiciary as a weapon against the independence movement, on and on and on and on, right? If you're not even allowed to bring up the idea of secession, or much less do it as a regional government, then you're in the wrong. I'll just flat out say it, right? The South had the right to secede in the U.S. Constitution because of the amendment that says that if it's not explicitly said in the Constitution, the states get it, right? And bear in mind that I am very much a statist. I'm very much someone that believes that in the right of the government to do things for the majority as long as it doesn't drastically harm the minority. Government needs to be able to do things because government is definitely a very viable solution to a lot of problems. Now, is it a solution to all our problems? No, and I'll be going on in another series I'm going to be doing next year called Rhombus Tix's Constitutional History of Terra, where I talk about, ideas about what we can do in the new Constitution, along with humorous anecdotes on the constitutional history of America on Terra. But I want it understood, right, that if you read the Constitution as is, especially before the 14th and 15th Amendment, it's very, very, very clear that if there is not language that says you can't do it, like education or other things, that it's very clearly the province of the states. And secession is not in any way, shape, or form mentioned anywhere in the core Constitution or the other 10 amendments. Now, the I now consider illegitimate Supreme Court said that, of course, states never had the right to secede, blah, 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 blah. But you know what? We already are living in a time where the Constitution is pretty much blatantly ignored by the court, as it was in this case, right? The court at that time was comprised of Republican-appointed judges who wanted to justify the Civil War. And the thing is that they didn't need to do that because the Union was entirely justified in both conquering the Confederacy and reabsorbing them into the Union after the Confederate dunce-caps declared war on the United States of America by attacking Fort Sumter, right? Saying that the South should have lost and that I'm glad they lost and lost badly is not the same as saying that they actually had a legitimate and viable argument to secede in the first place, right? Those are two different items. And unlike eugenics, separating secession from the slaving South is a solid argument. And I totally understand libertarians, especially left-leaning libertarians or anarchists, that, say that the state is corrupt, and, I get it, right? The thing is that it is my opinion, and I grant you that it is my opinion, that anarchy is impossible. And if anarchy is impossible, then you are always going to have some kind of government. And until we come up with something better, democracy is the only legitimate form of government because it regards the potential of each citizen within that government as equal and also a method of sustaining transition of power and adding legitimacy to a government. In other words, if you're going to have a government, you should make that government as morally fit as possible. Now, the libertarian idea of keeping government as minimal as possible has some merit, but the problem is that most of the arguments for libertarians come from the Enlightenment and garbage deistic concepts like natural law, right? Natural law is theocracy. The idea that you have laws bestowed by your creator is a monotheistic fallacy. And while I do believe in gods and think that the monotheistic gods exist plural, I I don't believe that they have a right to dictate how my government or any government is going to form. Theocracies are, if democracies are the best, most legitimate form of government, any form of theocracy is the worst form of government. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the characters that I don't think I've mentioned, right? So, Quiescence Prow is a clown show, and he's meant to be. He has a lot less, reading this back through, ironically, he isn't as big a presence as he in the second half as he was in the first half, and you know what? That's okay. He's more of a weapon / oracle that Hler picks up and adopts, and that actually shows, that ultimately the struggle of this book is about the different conspiracies with each other, and the fact that basically, at least in this world, Hler is right? All of the governments are run by these vast international conspiracies, which nowadays would be called globalism, and they were corrupt. The problem, of course, is that, well, in my fictional universe, the counterforce for that was a better, more benevolent version of globalism that was really more of a technocracy with highly democratic ideals, which still ended up becoming corrupt, is still infinitely better than the response in our reality, which is nationalism. And while nationalism itself isn't evil, it is definitely the colors by which the fascist paints himself, right? There may be a version of fascism that doesn't adopt nationalism, but I'm not aware of one. And certainly none of the fascist movements that we see around the world right now, which would include Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, the Republican Party, the axis of Z, none of these, Philippines, all of these countries are very nationalists. And the neo-nationalist movement / neo-fascism is promoted and encouraged by the former Soviet Union / Russia. Putin is definitely behind almost every single national movement in the world. And they look to him as a reflection of what they should be like, which is absolutely hilarious given their current anti-nationalism, 19th century imperialistic bullshit that Putin is currently doing in the Ukraine. And Quiescence Prow is somebody who, if you look at the Illuminatus trilogy, which are fascinating and political, very political in nature, Quiescence Prow is definitely somebody who would be illuminated, right? He's someone that could look at the world and see the way the world really works, at least in the back of his mind. Now, he doesn't seem to have a conscious understanding of that, but intuitively he does. He gets it. He sees the conspiracies for what they are. But his values, in my opinion, are paper thin, simply because of the fact that he ends up working for one of the conspiracies. Granted, the best of the conspiracies. If we talk about the different conspiracies that exist in this world. And by the way, ironically, given the fact that this book is about conspiracies fighting each other, except for the Cult of Innocence, I don't really go into that much detail about the conspiracies. The only two conspiracies you learn about are the Cult of Innocence, which is really more of a parasite that directs the other conspiracies that supposedly exist, or the Hler conspiracy, which is more of a counter-conspiracy. But the conspiracies that I go into great detail on, I don't talk about at all, right? In our world, in the real world, I would argue that we have at least two conspiracies, right? There's the Davos / actual New World Order globalist conspiracy, which, I'm sorry, clearly exists, right? I don't have to go into tinfoil hat territory to say that every year there are staunch corporate, rich and powerful individuals who meet in Davos on a regular basis to discuss what they think the world should be, right? That's not a conspiracy. That's an organization. It exists. And the other conspiracy is the axis of fascism, which again, clearly is not tinfoil hat territory. Russian influence exists all over the place in conservative movements all around the world. India, Hungary, Turkey, Brazil, the Philippines, more and more in Africa. It's garbage, and it's very real. Like, I don't have to make up these conspiracies. They're totally real. And Quiescence Prow, in my opinion, lost moral authority by working for one of them, even if it is the, quote, counter-conspiracy, end quote. Chester, for all his significant flaws, basically does everything he can to stay out of it, even if he does end up getting in bed with one of the conspiracy theories. But he still, in my opinion, is definitely the most heroic character of the novel, just because he stands by his principles. Like, it's clear that he does believe in the ideals of Hler, because he stays with them and gives his life, well, his conscious life, to defend them, at great cost to Hler, even though that ironically ends up being the thing that saves them. I don't want to go on about Darla. Darla is not my favorite character, and Darla was patterned after somebody that I no longer want to go into. But I will say this. I wrote this way before... Yeah, anyway. Amber Love is interesting and goes through an arc. But I'll be honest, I've written female characters in every single novel I've written. Strong, powerful female characters. And both of the female leads of this novel are by far the weakest of the female characters in any of my novels, right? I'm not going to call the female characters in the fourth novel that I wrote with Ken Leitner great, but they are in-depth, amazingly detailed characters by comparison to what is in this novel for Amber Love and Darla, and it's gross. I did a very good job of writing strong female characters in the first novel, and certainly in the third novel, and every novel since then. But I'm not proud of the female characters I wrote in this. In terms of other races or sexual orientation, look, I was Mormon when I wrote this thing, so expecting that in a male 15 years ago, a white cisgendered male 15 years ago, would be a little bit unrealistic. Yes, there were some that did it, but I'll apologize for stupid things I did in this book, including promoting libertarianism in any way, shape, or form. But I'm not going to apologize for the fact that even though I grew forward in my thinking, it took time, and I was not there when this was written. Now, fortunately, thank God, so far as I know, anyway, there is no anti-LGBT or racist bullshit in this, because even though I was an unenlightened person at the time I wrote this, I was not a complete asshole, as you would have to be anti-LGBT or a racist piece of shit. Of course, you could say it's racism by proxy, but given the fact that basically there are no minorities in this at all. They don't exist that I recall, except for maybe the Chinese, and they're mainly off camera. So is it racist? No. Is it not? Is it anti-racist? Definitely not. So, this, like I said, I'm probably never doing anything like this, and even if I do, it's going to be writing it from scratch. We'll see. Michael Onyx is the only character that appears in both the first and second novel. He is an anti-villain in both. He does good things, but does terrible things to make them happen. He actually has a much darker history than appears in either of the novels. Frankly, off the top of my head, none of the Hler people are even worth, Ferret and what's his name and what's her name, and yeah, I mean they're cardboard. I don't care. They're not memorable to me in any way, shape, or form. So, it is what it is. Anyway, if you've listened this far, especially in the commentary, what's wrong with you? But, if you have questions, I will always answer them. Feel free to write me at redanvilcreative at gmail.com. And better things are coming on the podcast for sure.